continuing on Python, and in particular this lecture is going to be on functions within functions. So basically the key idea is that I'm going to be covering, or actually defining, a function, a bigger function, and then within that bigger function there's going to be smaller functions with certain outputs. So the key idea here is that I have a bigger function. Within that bigger function I have smaller functions, and in the end I want to get the outputs of those smaller functions. So again, let's get into the code. I like to break it down as we go, and hopefully it will make much more sense that way. So let's say I have defined my func, and then we can immediately say that when I call this bigger function, I could say print this is pretty cool. Okay. And then I want to call my inner function, define James, just randomly. And then we could say return, just for diversity, instead of saying print so many times, to return this guy is cool. Okay. So one key thing here is that, of course, since I'm defining James inside of my func, it is indented within the same position as the print statement here. So it's not like I made it a totally separate function, right? If I indented it in the same position as to define my func, then it wouldn't necessarily be a function inside my func. So it has to be the same indentation or the same position as the print statement here. Okay, and then just for fun, let's say we could also have like another function. So define Jack, return this guy is cool. But we're not finished yet. I want to then say print Jack, and then I want to say print James. Okay, so you saw here that not only did I mention the functions that I wanted, the inner functions, and I included the return statements, but also I said print Jack and print James at the end. Now the function of these two print statements is that it's going to return the outputs of Jack and James, which were these strings. This guy is cool, and this guy is cool. So I said that 2 times, but basically the key idea here is that when I'm going to call this my func, this bigger function, it's going to return these outputs. And the key component here is that even myself, I sometimes forget this, but keep in mind that you need to use these print statements in the end to solidify and to confirm that you want to return these strings. So let's actually run this, and then I will call my func. There you go. Awesome. So this, that should have been this is. I misspelled. So this is pretty cool. That is from this bigger my func. So it printed this string. And then also I got the outputs of Jack and James, right? Because I have this guy is cool. There you go. And then I have it one more time because I also printed out the output of Jack. So it was this guy is cool as well. Okay. So again, that is now one of the simple examples. In the next part, I'm going to be going over a more upper level kind of example, and then from there we'll go on to a more complex kind of example, and we'll go through how to do that. So hopefully this example made sense, and hopefully that was a good introduction to the functions within functions idea. And as I mentioned, we're going to be going over the more intermediate example. So of course, let me first write out the code. I want to say define my func, let's just call that. And then I wanted to say, for example, print, is this going very well? Very well. Okay. Yeah, right, cool in there. Okay, so then we can just go and proceed with what we did before in the previous example, the more simple example, by just saying James, define James, we said, let's say return, he is pretty cool. And then define Jack, return, he is also very cool. But now here's the catch. And actually I should have written this, numbers equal to 50 beforehand. But basically what I'm going to do here is that I have my condition already stated or already mentioned. You know here that I said the number, right? That's my condition. Number is equal to 50. Now here's how it's going to play out. So I want to say if number is equal to 50, this is in terms of conditional statements, print James, but if number, let's say, I don't know, was less than 50, print Jack. Okay, so let's kind of see how this is going out, or like what this is trying to say. So again, define my func, that was my bigger function, of course, and then inside I have this argument number is equal to 50. So that's the condition, right? I have my argument already defined, and the number is equal to 50 is the argument. Then I have, of course, the functions, the smaller functions within this bigger my func, which are James and Jack, and I have these outputs. And then I wrote the conditions here. I said if my number is equal to 50, then print James, the output of James. But if my number is less than 50, I want to print this output, or get the output of Jack. So let's again see how this works. My func, I want to call it, boom. So I got two outputs, so I got this is going very well. What output was that? That was the output of the my func, right? The print statement that I have here. Okay, and then I have this output. He is pretty cool. Which output was that? That was, he is pretty cool, was the output of the James function. Okay, that makes sense because my condition I had was number is equal to 50 in the beginning. That was the argument I passed through inside this bigger my func. And I said that if my number is equivalent to 50, then I want the output of James, which I got. James was, he is pretty cool, and he is pretty cool is right here, as you can see. Now, I didn't have to define my argument in the beginning. I could have just said number. I just want a number. But here's an error. I need to pass in the number inside my func because that's an argument that I defined here, right? So, for example, let's call a number less than 50 in this case, such as 48. Okay, kind of different, but again, we have that print statement of the bigger my func, which is this is going very well. That also occurred in the previous example that I had, which involved the number equals to 50. And also you can see that he is also very cool. It's mentioned here. He is also very cool. It's the output of Jack. And that makes sense because in the conditional statements that I put, I said if number is less than 50, then print Jack. And Jack's output was he is also very cool, which I got right here. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to a more complex example. And this is going to kind of involve turning off and on the kind of like the loop or the functions that we have essentially. So we'll be looking into that complex example now. All right, guys. So now we're going to be going over the more complex example. And this example is kind of unique in the sense that it deals with decorators. And if you're not familiar with that term, don't worry about that at all. We're going to go over the code, of course, but there's kind of a twist in terms of not only does it deal with functions within functions, that's the whole basic idea of it. But again, there's kind of a twist in the terms of how we're going to code this. And you'll see what I mean. But let's again get into the code. So let's say define my func, and I want to pass an argument here. It's not a number, but it's going to be a function actually, which is kind of again unique in that sense. And then I want to define my wrap func. You can call this whatever. What I'm doing here is that I'm defining that smaller function, right? And I want to say, for example, print this is great, print this is cool, and then I want to define, or I should say I want to return the value, or I should say the output of the function that I'm passing into this my func here. Again, what I'm doing here is that I'm defining, or I'm going to return the output of whatever the function that I have is being passed in this this whole function here, the bigger function. Now, I also want to say, of course, then I want to return the wrap func. I want to return all of this, right? When I define this my func. So the reason why I said return wrap func, or I said return this guy here, was because I want to get these outputs. I want to get this string, I want to get this string, I want to get this string, and I want to get the output of whatever function that I'm passing in to this my func here. Okay. But what is that function going to be? What is that argument that we're going to pass in? So again, here's that twist. So that function, we'll have to define it in another line. And we'll say define, for example, my, I guess, other func, just for randomness. And we can say print, this is awesome. Okay. Now, if I just run this, this kind of makes sense because, of course, I defined this whole thing and this whole thing is separate cells, so nothing happened, right? That makes sense. Nothing is supposed to happen, but the idea here was that we wanted to get this print statement, this print statement, and we wanted to get this output. This output would be this function here, the output of my other func, which would be this print statement. So how do I connect this whole function here to this wrap function and at the same time get the whole outputs of all of this? So I want to get the output of these two strings and the output of this. And that's kind of interesting and weird because, of course, this my other func is completely separate. It's not defined inside, right? This my func necessarily. So how do we do that? And I actually like this because this is kind of cool because this kind of acts as an on and off switch. Here's what I mean. So let's say that we have at. We have to use this symbol actually, the at symbol that you use when you're writing an email or your email has that symbol, right? Like at gmail.com. So we say at, and then what we want to write is at my func. This whole big function here. Boom. Huh. Kind of like magic there, but so you could see here that this is great. Was this first print statement? I got that. Awesome. This is cool. Was the second print statement? Awesome. And we also got this print statement, which was a part of this my other func here. This function that was totally outside, not even defined inside this bigger my func here, inside the wrap, essentially, I should say. So kind of what this does is when I say at my func, when I call this kind of my func in terms of this sense, or essentially I wrote it this way, is that it's looping this function. It's taking this function as an argument and putting it into this wrap func here. So again, let me reiterate this. I'm calling this my func. It's going to take this whole function here as an argument. That makes sense, right? Okay. And then we're going to take the output and put it in terms of this wrap func. And then since I have the output, which was print, this is awesome, as this statement I had here, func, and the end is going to return the wrap func. So what that's going to do basically is it's going to take not only the output of this function that I had here, which was this is awesome, but also these two print statements. So the big idea here is that this decorator acts kind of as a loop. It's going to loop in this function and take its output and return it with the other two outputs I had, or other codes that I had in this wrap func here, in this smaller function. So kind of again, this was a complex example, but again, it all deals with a function within a function. That's the whole point. We're getting the output of not only this function, but also these two other pieces of code that I had. So I hope this lecture and this example in particular was informative, because this essentially was another technique or another way you could define a function within a function. And I personally really enjoyed it because it's like really cool and really just, again, it kind of acts kind of like magic in my opinion, because it's a totally different function in another cell that you're going to be then just returning its output inside this whole piece of code here. But if you guys have any other questions, I know this was complex, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to help you guys out on this. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.